The new Samsung Galaxy Watch 5 Pro is not what you think it is. In years past, Samsung has sort of been making two lines of watches, a classic version with a physical rotating bezel that looks nice in any occasion, and then the active or sport version, which was lighter and smaller but delivered the same internal specs and performance in a sportier looking watch. So with the new Watch 5 and the Watch 5 Pro, it seems that many assumed that the Watch 5 Pro was Samsung's way of making a sequel to the Watch 4 Classic, but without the rotating bezel. And honestly, that's just not the case. So in my opinion, this watch, the Watch 5 Pro, was designed for a different market entirely. The Watch 5 Pro has a raised bezel to protect the display, a claimed 4-day battery life, turn-by-turn directions for custom hiking or trail biking routes, and features that make it clear that this watch was intended to be for a more fitness and sport-oriented crowd. So while this is undoubtedly their new flagship smartwatch, we need to look at this under two different lenses. So we need to look at the Galaxy Watch 5 Pro under two different lenses. And the first one is essentially as a sports watch, sort of like a Garmin or a Suunto watch, because that's kind of how Samsung is marketing this device. It's more durable, like I said. It's supposed to have a long battery life. Anybody going on backpacking trips or trail biking or kayak adventures, things like that, this would really be Samsung's choice for you. And then the other lens would be as an everyday watch, because like I said, this is still Samsung's flagship smartwatch. So if you're trying to, for example, upgrade your Galaxy Watch 4 Classic, you might consider buying this. And by the way, don't worry, I will make a full comparison between this and the Galaxy Watch 4 Classic. If you want to see that, go down, definitely click that subscribe button. The video is coming very, very soon, and you really don't want to miss it. The differences are really interesting to say the least. So let's start off with the physical design. This watch is only available in 45 millimeters. That's going to be a turn off for some, and I know a lot of other reviews out there have been saying it's a chunky watch, but hear me out on this one. I think that this is actually a great size to have. I wish they had a smaller version. Yes, I mean, this clearly excludes anyone with smaller wrists, so like half the population. But for me, I have a pretty average sized wrist. I wouldn't say my wrists are large or anything, but I feel like it looks and feels really like the right size for my wrist. It also, I know people have been saying it's very chunky, but it doesn't feel heavy. I ran with this today, and trust me, I'm very picky with heavy watches on my wrist. This one doesn't move around a lot. I think it's partially because I really do like the strap it comes with. I'll talk about that in a second, but the watch itself feels like a durable watch. It also doesn't feel too heavy. We have titanium as a full body on there, which does keep it strong and light at the same time. And although it sticks up a lot, it doesn't, I mean, a lot of that is just the raised bezel around there. So that is going to protect it, which by the way, I know there's mixed reviews on that. Protecting the display by a raised bezel is a huge positive in my opinion. I've never really been one to put cases on my watch. I just think they're too bulky and annoying. But my Galaxy Watch Active 2 actually got completely destroyed when I was rock climbing once. Just kind of hit a rock. I hit the edge with a rock and it just destroyed the display. Additionally, we're getting a sapphire crystal display, so it should be, as they said, 2x stronger, so substantially more durable than most other smartwatches out there. And the only unfortunate thing here that I'm not a big fan of is the display is only 1.4 inches. So 45 millimeter body, 1.4 inch display, and they really don't do a lot with the surroundings, so you really notice that bezel. It's a big black ring around there. They could put tick marks on there. I think that would look good. Something like that, I think really would hide it a little better. The bezel that kind of tapers in does actually have its advantage though. So for me, I find it's easier to use the digital bezel on here. So no physical rotating bezel, but much like the Watch 4 and the Watch Active 2, we have a digital bezel, so you can kind of spin your finger around, navigate the interface. And unlike the previous versions, we now have something to kind of reference our finger off of. So you kind of just push radially outwards and spin your finger around, and it's a lot easier to use that. So definitely a silver lining with having that sunken in display. And of course, on the right side, we have our microphone. On the left side, we have our speaker. We'll get into a test of those in a second. But the buttons, these are just like we saw before last year. These will double as your health sensors as well if you're doing something like a biometric impedance, or if you're doing an ECG or a lot of those kind of measurements, those are going to be an additional sensor there. And the buttons actually are really very tactile and nice. I really like the buttons. They feel like a premium button to me. On the back of the watch, you can see the new health array. This is slightly different than the previous ones, and it is supposed to be flatter for more contact area on your skin for more accurate readings, which of course I will get into a full accuracy test. I did a lot of testing with this, but a new addition back here is actually a temperature sensor. And the temperature sensor, I assume in the future can be used for many more things as well. For example, maybe it's like female cycle tracking. Maybe you're doing things like tracking your sleep a little more accurately. The temperature usually is not an instantaneous measurement. It's more of like a long-term trend tracking. And so that's where I think that really could be a useful sensor to have. The strap that it comes with, I actually really like. It's infinitely adjustable by sliding it back and forth, and then with friction, it kind of stays in really well. And of course, you kind of snap it back into place with kind of a very similar design to most metal chain bracelet watches. Now, this, in my opinion, like I said, is very comfortable. I was so surprised when I put it on. I thought for sure I was going to hate this design, but it's actually arguably the most comfortable watch strap I've worn with a watch of this size. The only downside of this strap, if you don't have a large wrist, and like I said, I have a pretty medium-sized wrist, is the band does kind of stick out a little bit on the side, so you can kind of see a profile right there. Now, let's actually get a little bit more into the features. So once again, this is Wear OS 3, but it's running Samsung's version of that. So the Samsung has a lot of their own stuff on top of here. And so essentially, quick interface tour. If we cycle around to the right, we get all of our tiles. And these can be all types of different things, like our bioimpedance, so we can do a measurement there and see what our body fat is, or a BMI and things like that. We can actually have route tracking. That's a new thing. So we can have a route that if you have a GPX file and you want to put it onto your watch, and then you plan on doing like a trail biking, for example, that's a great way to kind of have your route and know where you're going to go, so you're not always like pulling out a map and stopping, or even worse, getting lost. But if you do get lost, they also have track back on here that can kind of use the GPS to guide you back to where you started, which could be a very convenient feature for anybody running on a big network of trails. Of course, we have all of our typical tiles like playback controls, sleep tracking, weather, calendar, blood oxygen, and ECG. We've got a lot of things like that as you go through here. But going back to the home screen, we can swipe down, get to our quick notifications, and as always, Samsung really packs this full of very useful features, like for example, an underwater mode, which disables the screen if you're gonna go for a swim, or what I use it for whenever I take a shower, so I'm not accidentally, calling somebody or doing something like that. If we swipe up from the bottom, this is your app drawer, all the different apps you have. It's not like my favorite layout, but you can see everything very easily and it gets the job done. And if you swipe from the left, these are your notifications from your phone, and you do have quick replies and all types of things like that. It's very easy to interact with notifications on here. Of course, the buttons, if we press and hold them, you'll get either a Samsung Pay on the bottom or Bixby. Now, I know you can get Google Assistant on here, but by default, it does come with Bixby. And when you use Bixby, personally, it doesn't really work well for me. So for example, if I ask it for the weather in Bala Cynwyd or in Manayunk, like those are both areas right outside of Philly. Google gets it right every single time, but let's see what Bixby does. What's the weather in Manayunk, Pennsylvania? What's the weather in Bala Cynwyd? Again, completely wrong. It is nice you can double press the bottom button to switch between different apps you have open, and that's something I especially use when I'm, for example, traveling and using app in the air. It's an app that I talked about in a different video that allows me to track like my flights and things like that, and I can toggle between app in the air and any other thing I have open. Now, of course, you might be using this for phone calls or voice assistant, so let's get into a speaker and microphone test.
All right, so this is a microphone test with the Galaxy Watch 5 Pro. Honestly, I think the speaker sounds pretty good, but leave a comment and let me know how clear it sounds to you and if you can hear what I'm saying.
All right, so this is a microphone test with the watch. Leave a comment and let me know how clear this sounds to you. Honestly, the watch microphones always do a pretty good job, so I expect this to sound pretty good. Now, I mentioned we have a new health sensor array on the back, so when it comes to actually tracking your workouts, starting off with the GPS, I found that this was incredibly accurate. So running a known like 1.7 miles, it came to 1.70, so exactly correct on that. And if you look at this map of where I was running around, or actually biking in this case, it took every single turn almost exactly, with the exception of this turn was cut a little bit short, and this other kind of little S shape was squiggled a little bit incorrectly, but by and large, it was almost exactly correct. Now, as far as the heart rate sensor goes, this is an optical heart rate sensor, of course, but it still does a really impressive job. However, as with most optical heart rate sensors, it does lag very slightly. So when you start running, it takes a second till it gets up to where your heart rate actually is. So if you're doing things like very quick intervals, it might not be perfect there. And then, of course, battery. They're claiming 80 hours of use. From my testing, in about 1 day, you get about 31% battery drain. So that would give you about 2.5 to 3 days if you're doing like an hour of GPS use per day and you're using this watch pretty heavily. With that being said, that's still substantially better than almost any other watch like this on the market, being, compared to like the Galaxy watches of the past and Apple watches as well. So that is very impressive. But when this is being marketed as a sports watch, that's where you really start to have some trouble, because a lot of Garmin watches and Suunto watches can easily go substantially longer than that, plus they'll have things like a solar panel on the front. So by those comparisons, this really doesn't do a great job. And this goes back to what I was saying about looking at this under two different lenses. Compared to everyday smartwatches, this has a great battery. Compared to sports watches, this has really not a good battery. But besides the battery, under the hood of this watch is very similar to the Galaxy Watch 4, from storage to essentially the same chip in there as well. And besides a couple off-grid features like route tracking, which we might even see that as an update for the Watch 4, the differences here are really going to be the longer battery life, the redesigned health sensor array, which includes a temperature sensor and lays flatter on your wrist. And if you're really nitpicking, we also have Bluetooth 5.2 on here instead of 5.0, slightly different. But like I said, the internals of this are not really that different. The big difference here is going to be the physical redesign and the addition of those new features. And speaking of new features, there's a couple of health-focused ones I wanted to highlight as well, including more advanced sleep coaching and an improved UI for sleep tracking to understand what you can improve and what's going wrong with your sleep. Additionally, heart recovery is kind of a new thing as well. And of course, we have a lot of the classic ones like body composition and ECG still on here as well. But let's talk about the drawbacks. Specifically, if you look at this under the lens of a sports watch, as I mentioned, the battery is your first uphill battle there. Samsung's marketing this as a sports watch and competing with Garmin and Suunto watches, but the battery life definitely doesn't compete on that front. Additionally, Samsung Health makes it impossible to export TCX files and only really integrates with a few software services out there. Samsung does not play nicely with third-party devices like heart rate straps or things like that, and of course, the buttons do very little when working out. By contrast, most other sports watches have 3 or 4 buttons that control the majority of the watch when you're working out, and your hands are sweaty and it's hard to control a touchscreen. So in that light, it's a little bit difficult. So this watch sort of strikes out against the biggest sports watches out there, but of course, those often have a clunky UI. They have no voice assistant, they have no speaker, they have no microphone, they don't get apps, and they have a lot of other compromises that you're going to have if you go with the classic sports watch that you don't have to make if you go with this. So if you care about these things, then you've most likely been disappointed by sports watches in the past, and that's where this really starts to shine. So this is tricky because, as I've been saying throughout this whole video, if you look at it as a sports watch, it honestly struggles to compete. If you look at it as an everyday watch, it's great, but it lacks the rotating bezel, so why would you get this instead of the Galaxy Watch 4? But if you look at this as a new middle ground, for those who want an everyday smartwatch for apps and weather and tracking flights and Uber rides and things like that, but who also loves to go for long bike rides or an occasional backpacking trip, and you want the battery to last more than one day, this is the perfect watch. And interestingly enough, for me personally, I definitely fit into that last category. So for a long time, I've been using the Garmin Venue 2S because it works as an everyday smartwatch, kind of, but mostly does really great with a longer battery life and more a fitness-oriented lifestyle. But this is now going to replace that for me, probably as my everyday watch for a pretty long time. So I'm very happy with this device, and maybe in the future we'll get some updates to give us better wrist gestures or customizable buttons during workouts. As for the rotating bezel, I suspect Samsung could come out with the Watch 5 Classic, perhaps in February at their Unpacked event. Oh, and also, this is Android only, sort of Samsung only actually. If you care about the ECG and bioimpedance, it's Samsung only. For anything else, it's Android only. And if you're an iPhone user, I don't know what to tell you. But if you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing, leave a comment below, and let me know what you think of the Galaxy Watch 5 Pro. Thanks for watching, I'm Mike O'Brien, and I'll see you next time.